we talked a lot about domestic violence this week, and a lot of that talk has come up from the most recent case from last Wednesday, when a 33-year-old woman, Shalimar Green, along with her 11-year-old daughter, Olivia, they were killed by, police say, Derek Green. Derek Green is the one accused in their killings. This was part of a domestic violence incident. This is him.
And he's now charged with 2 counts of murder.
Right. The two were in the process of going through a split and had been lengthily involved in domestic violence cases. There had been a charge against him a few years prior for a strangulation of her. That had been dropped later.
Yeah.
So the larger picture of this
is that domestic violence cases are rising in
they
Central
are.
Ohio.
We saw a 40% rise from 2024 to 2025. So 114 deaths in 2024. That jumped to 157
and then
in 2025.
And then this year alone, we've had more instances. So it's just, I mean, I'm really anxious to see the full numbers for 2026. But yeah, I mean, that's too many for the resources that are available out there. But today we're talking more about, I mean, there's a lot of psychology that goes into these types of relationships. We know they're complicated, and it can be physical, mental, emotional. It can be all of that wrapped into one. And joining us right now to talk more about this and just how challenging it is for people to get up and leave those situations, and more of like the thoughts behind that to help everyone better understand that it's not as easy as I'm just going to get up and leave. It doesn't work like that. Kind of like how they say healing does not happen in a straight line. There's, avenues to it. So joining us right now, Jenice Johnson. She's the Associate Manager of OhioHealth, Sexual Assault Response Network of Ohio. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so as you just heard, we're hearing more and more about domestic violence situations happening across Central Ohio. Now, from your perspective, what do you think is driving this increase that we're seeing right now?
Well, there are several factors that are driving the increase in domestic violence and intimate partner violence. Let me first begin by saying perpetrators are responsible for the violence that they inflict on others, ultimately. However, there are several contributing factors, which it would include right now, the social economic climate could be a factor. Individuals are stressed. There are unmanaged mental health symptoms, trauma that has been untreated. And so all of those factors contribute to that increase. In addition to that, with social media now and the media, there is also an increase, which is good, in reporting instances of intimate partner violence as well. So all those have impact.
And you kind of mentioned it right there, is that more and more of these cases are just getting some publicity out there, whether that be online or in traditional media formats, because for a long time, domestic violence and domestic abuse was something that was often not talked about. It was kept hush hush. So we didn't hear about it as much. And nowadays we do hear a lot. So is it safe to say that these numbers have probably always existed? It's just that nowadays we are hearing about them more.
That is a good possibility that we hear about them more now. I will say, I do acknowledge that there likely is an increase. We often see an increase in some of our younger demographics with teens and high school students as well. However, media does play an important factor also.
And can you explain it's so easy to say, well, why didn't you just get up and leave that situation? Why didn't you leave him? Why didn't you leave her? But can you go in depth about why that's actually very, very complicated for a lot of people?
Absolutely. When it comes to intimate partner violence and domestic violence, those relationships, what others fail to realize is that the victim in those relationships is in love with their perpetrator. Okay. And so although they want that abuse to stop, they're also in love with the perpetrator. And so that is one reason that it's hard for a victim to leave. In addition to that, we also have to realize that because of the trauma that is involved in intimate partner relationships, that victim is experiencing shame, often blames herself Often there are other factors such as finances, children, when they're involved. She may be also feeling pressure to stay in that relationship from other outside forces. And so um, those are some of the reasons why victims remain in those relationships.
And you mentioned, that finances get involved there. We know that domestic violence looks different in all sorts of different cases, and many people might not think, well, I'm not in a dangerous situation because, well, that other person, they're not hitting me. But we know oftentimes that domestic abuse can start with financial abuse, controlling of the financing. It looks a lot different for other people. Tell us a little about what are some of the, because the extreme is that physical hitting, touching, but it's oftentimes starts much smaller to get to that point. Talk about that lead up there.
Sure. So there is often a escalation when it comes to abuse in relationships. And so it may start out as controlling the finances, where if the victim needs money for, let's say, food or resources for the children, where they're having to go to their significant other to get those resources, where they might withhold them. The perpetrator might withhold finances for whatever reason. In addition to that, victims also experience a lot of emotional, psychological, and verbal abuse, being put down, called outside of their names, things of that nature. And all of that takes a toll on the victim and how she feels about herself.
And we know in 2025, there were 157 fatalities from domestic violence. When you hear that number and someone is trying to get away from their domestic violence situation, obviously it can turn violent very, very fast. But how dangerous can it become? Is death the worst end of this?
Absolutely. And so when victims make that decision to leave, that is when they are most often at their highest risk of physical violence and even death. And so we often advise victims to connect with an advocate. There has to be safety planning involved. Victims have to plan to leave so that they can get out safely. And so that is so important to emphasize that they it's to just up and leave. That's not always the safest situation for that victim. And in the case also in certain cases, others might get harmed in that process as well.
And getting out, as you mentioned, getting out safely is important. And for some people, it is that the availability of where to go next is what complicates that. And we know that local shelters oftentimes are full, that they don't have the space to take on someone and their kids. What does that tell you about the need in our community, whether that be Central Ohio or anywhere right now, to take care of these people escaping these situations?
I think that it speaks to the increased need in resources. And so, as specifically in Franklin County, we have one DV shelter. And so, we need to be able to provide additional space for survivors that might be needing to get out of a dangerous or a violent situation. And so, our city leaders are taking steps toward making changes with the creation of the new domestic violence task force, where they're coming together to kind of fill in some of the gaps in services. But the fact that the shelter is almost always near capacity, it just speaks to the need for additional resources.
Now, besides shelters being at max capacity and oftentimes almost close to max capacity on a weekly basis, what are the other gaps that you're seeing right now that need to be filled?
Survivors and victims of, and I use that term interchangeably, of intimate partner violence, domestic violence, they need wraparound services. And so, in addition to like housing, if someone is getting away from a perpetrator who was responsible for all the finances, she's going to need employment. They might need some workforce training. They also will need counseling, therapy, to kind of to work through some of the traumatic experience that she's experienced during that relationship. And so often case management to help, link them to other resources in the community if it's needed, healthcare, things of that nature. And so I also often talk about the wraparound services that survivors need when coming out of those relationships.
And for anyone maybe watching who's in a situation where it might be abusive, what is the very first step that they should take?
Um, just first to know that you are not alone, but we want to get you connected with an advocate who can offer you that validation and emotional support. You can reach out to the Center for Family Safety and Healing is one resource. If you're here in Central Ohio, and that number is 614-224-4663. You can also contact us here at Sarnco, and that number is 844-644-6435. And you can connect with one of our advocates.
All right, Jenice Johnson with Sarnco. Thank you so much for joining us here on The Big Picture. Obviously, a big topic right now that continually gets thrust into the front of mind of the conversation.
And we can't spread the word enough about the steps that should be taken and how to keep, men, women, and families safe.